Praise the Lord. Much of this particular study involves the immutability of God's promise and how God ultimately does fulfill His promise. But we take this little epoch in the middle of the study, the second class here, to talk about those who disqualified themselves from remaining in the line. However, in spite of the naysayers, God still is faithful to fulfill His promise. But in order to make any study complete, we have to cover positive and negative examples. The positive is that God's promise is immutable. God's plan that He laid out for Abraham and for Moses and for many of the patriarchs, it's immutable. It's going to be fulfilled. Absolutely will be fulfilled. The only question will be whether historically the children of Israel would all take part in it or that they would be disqualified. You know, it's whenever we are involved in some sort of, whether it's a competition or we're applying for something or whatever, it's always a distressing feeling to realize that you've been eliminated from the running. They're no longer considering your name. I remember back in grade school during the spelling bee, I knew it was coming. I might make it like 3 layers deep or 4 layers deep, but I'm going to be sitting down. And it always was a disappointment. I gave it my best shot, but it was always disappointment. But then we had some brainiacs in school, but it's always disappointing to be eliminated. It's always disappointing. And as our discussion after the class last week, God's promise is immutable, but at the same time, the scriptures tell us that He showed His people His breach of promise because of, their own behavior, because of their unbelief, basically. Evil heart of unbelief. But that didn't change the promise of God. It didn't change the immutability of God's promise that He was going to fulfill His promise to Abraham. What it did was it eliminated them from the running. They were no longer a part of that line. And so while most of this class is designed to encourage and strengthen us in the promises of God, tonight we have to focus in on reasons why people were eliminated from the running. And then next week we'll get back into the positive aspects of it here. And so tonight, I felt as though God laid on my heart 4 different particular areas, where throughout this fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, there were certain sections of people or certain attributes that they manifested that took them out of the line. You see, God is going to fulfill His word. There's no question about that. When God gives a promise to a nation, when God gives a promise to a fellowship, when God gives a promise, He's going to fulfill that promise. The question will be, who's going to be there at the finish line? That's the question that's before us. In 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 4, it says, whereby are given to us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these you might be partakers of the divine nature, and so forth. And then in chapter 1, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 10, he says, make your calling and your election sure. So he's saying that great and precious promises have been given, but it's not a foregone conclusion. We still have to remain in the race, as it were. Let me ask this question here, and I know you guys are all Bible scholars, so you know it. What was the sin of Esau? Well, we know we can look into the scriptures and find out that, it was attributed to him of being profane and a fornicator and so forth. But the sin of Esau was he despised the birthright. The sin of Esau was that he despised his birthright. He had no eternal vision. He attributed nothing to the birthright that exceeded more than a bowl of beans. And that was the sin of Esau. And because of his desire to satisfy a temporal need, he actually took himself out of the running. He eliminated himself because of temporal needs. And I think that this is something that's going to be very pronounced in the last days. People would like many things in this world. One of the things they like is security. But in the days in which we live, there will only be one place of security. There will only be one place of preservation, and it will be, according to Psalm 91, under the shadow of His wings. Under the shadow of His wings. But many will choose other solutions, I guess you'd call it. It's not really a solution at all. But Esau said, what good is this birthright to me because I'm starving to death? And people make decisions based on those things. I have a temporal need. I have something in my life that it threatens me. And so what good is this eternal promise to me? I'm perishing. Well, the truth of the matter is he was not dying. He perceived he was dying. He was not dying. He would have probably had a few rough hours, but he'd have survived just fine. But instead, he reacted and took himself out of something eternal. You might say he despised the promise, although I know we're talking about the right of the firstborn. The Lord said the following to a whole generation in the wilderness. In Numbers chapter 14, verse 30, ye shall not come into the land concerning which I swear to make you dwell therein, save Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. And in chapter 14 and verse 34, he said, you're going to know my breach of promise. So last week we talked about the immutability of God's promise. And that is true. God did fulfill that promise and did exactly what he said he was going to do. The word that goes forth from the mouth of the Lord accomplishes the thing for which it was purposed and finishes, that for which it was sent. But there was a whole generation who were eliminated from the running. See, we talked earlier at the beginning about being eliminated from something, being considered for something, and then being eliminated from it. And so why did God say this to them? Why did God tell them that they would know his breach of promise? Well, it was behavior-based. It was related to their behavior. It was related to their relationship with him. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 10 to 12 says, wherefore I was grieved with that generation. It said, they do always err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swear in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. An evil heart of unbelief. So it wasn't the giants. It wasn't the enemy that kept them from inheriting. It wasn't the enemy that took them out of the line. It was the fact that God said something, God whose credibility is irreproachable, God said something to them and they chose not to believe it. An evil heart of unbelief. And so tonight we'll discover the reasons why some did not enter into the promise even though they should have. Now the point of this and the reason why this is necessary to include it in such a study where you're trying to encourage people about the promise of God, the reason why it's essential is because some didn't enter in. And so we need to be instructed by this. We need to guard our hearts. We need to be careful about the opinions that we formulate in our trials to make sure, as Paul said, that our calling and our election is sure so that we cross the finish line. Now, that was all by way of introduction. Are you proud of me how tightly I kept that introduction? Nice, concise little introduction. No, Pastor Frank, most people do that. Very good. So the first thing I want to consider with you, the first group, I should say, of those, and we've already alluded to them, are the 10 spies. And not only the 10 spies, but a whole generation that were polluted by the words of the 10 spies. You know something? Folks, be careful. Please. Be careful about those you align yourself with. Now, I'm not talking about exclusivity. I'm not talking about any nonsense like that. I'm saying that spirits are in words. Testimonies convey thoughts and spirits and power, and they can either strengthen you or they can weaken you. And this is what happened with the 10 spies. They came back and they poured out their evil report upon the whole nation, and they disqualified an entire generation by their words. Words are powerful. Words are powerful. Many, many times I've preached this. When the enemy came to Adam and Eve, he didn't assault them. He didn't threaten them. He didn't put them in chains. He spoke to them. He knocked them off the path completely just by his words. There's spirit and there's life in words. The Proverbs tell us that the wise follow the wise. Why? Because they drink in their counsel. They listen to their counsel and they listen to their judgment and they follow and behave in a way that reflects the wise. But these 10 spies, they're going to have a lot to answer for. They disqualified an entire generation. Numbers chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Send thou men that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel. The word of the Lord was, I've given you this land. He just was sending them out so that they could see what their inheritance was going to look like. Which I give to the children of Israel. Which I give to them. But what did they come back and say in Numbers chapter 13, verse 31? But the men that went up with him said, We be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, The land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. They saw the giants, and they didn't believe, even though God had expressly said through the leadership, that's an important point. God expressly said through the leadership, I've given you this land. I've given this to you to inherit. But their testimony was evil. And so this is the sin of the 10 spies and ultimately the whole congregation except for Joshua and Caleb. They rejected the word of the Lord. You know, as a pastor, sometimes you are asked to give counsel to people, and you pray and you seek the Lord, and God gives you a word. And you feel the witness that it's a word, and perhaps even God confirms this through many different means. But then you go and you share it with the individual as counsel from the Lord that will save them if they listen. And instead they doubt the veracity of it, they doubt the counsel, they doubt that God is speaking. Maybe they say it out loud, or maybe they just bury it in their heart and don't do it. But then, you see them go out and they will never prosper. They will never prosper because they have rejected the word of the Lord. And so as we mentioned in Hebrews, we were told that this was an evil heart of unbelief. God said, I've given you the land, and they said, we're not strong enough. We can't do this. Now, we've got to believe the things that God says to us. We've got to embrace them. A little while back, I preached a message concerning, committing to the word of the Lord, committing to what God said, and being enthusiastic about it. That's what God is looking for. So they had their evil heart of unbelief. Now, I mentioned this aspect of the leadership. The leadership. God, now there are exceptions, of course, to this. You'll understand, hopefully, what I'm saying, and I'll clarify to make sure. There are exceptions. There are times when leaders have sin in their life. They have unrighteousness in their life. I myself was called to a church one time where a pastor was being censured, and I was brought in to kind of as damage control, you might say. But generally speaking, that's not the case. If you're in a church where you have a God-fearing leader, you need to listen to the leader. This counsel didn't come to the people. This counsel came to Moses and to the leadership. So in actual fact, what they were rejecting was Moses' counsel, but in actual fact, they were rejecting God's counsel. Now, I've heard over the years people say this, and it really, as soon as I hear it, even though I may not with my natural eyes roll my eyes in my spirit, I'm going, oh boy, here we go again. But people say things like, I only need to hear from Jesus. I may not obey the counsel of the church, but at least I'm listening to Jesus. Phooey, can I say phooey? Phooey? Nonsense? That's utter nonsense. That's pride. That's arrogance. If you really are walking with the Lord, trust me, you can hear the voice of God in almost anyone. And even your leaders. Amazing as it seems. I only need to hear from the Lord. But that's false. That's pride. If you're really a spiritual individual, you can hear the Lord speaking in the voice of your leaders. You hear God speaking in the voice of the leadership of the church. You hear God speaking many times through the brethren. I remember one time, actually, I received the word of the Lord, and I knew it was the word of the Lord from a woman who wasn't even saved. I only need to hear from Jesus. Well, I'll tell you what. There are going to be many people in eternity where God is going to say, this is the counsel that you received. Why didn't you follow it? Well, I was waiting for Jesus to speak. Well, I got a news flash for you. He was speaking through your leadership. If there's no unrighteousness in the leadership, then you're best to defer to them. You're best to defer to them. Trust me, you are. I don't know if I've been faithful to this, but I tried to be faithful, that even in cases where my pastor came to me and he gave me counsel, and I myself didn't see it, I deferred to his counsel. I deferred to it. I've always believed in the counsels of David, where David said, leave him alone. If the Lord sent him, who am I to resist? But if he hasn't been sent by the Lord, and my pastor has, I'm just saying this in a hypothetical state. I'm just saying that this was my mentality. If I'm submitting to it, and God sees that I'm being wronged by it, he'll bless me. That's what David said. You can't lose. I only need to hear from Jesus. I'm waiting for Jesus to speak. Well, if he's speaking to your leader, it's not likely he's going to speak anything different to you personally. I think it was your brother Paul who said that if you ask the Lord to come down and speak to you something fresh, and the Lord appeared in front of you and he spoke to you, he said, you find it's what God has been speaking to you all along. It'll be the same thing you've been hearing throughout your whole life. Because that's very true. And so the humble man or the humble woman can hear the voice of the Lord through others. Hebrews chapter 3 verses 10 to 12, God's wrath was expressed against them not because they did not obey the Lord's voice spoken directly to them, but they did not obey the voice that was spoken to them through their leaders. We like to have this personal sovereignty. I'm not sure if that's the right way to describe it or not, whereby, we need no man teach us, but only Jesus himself. If that's the way we live our life, we're going to come to the end of our life and be very disappointed. God speaks through the leadership. That's the reason leadership has been given. Now, I want to move on from that because I think we've rehearsed that quite enough, and you're very well versed in that anyway. I want to come now to a second people group that took themselves out of the line, and this is a little bit more serious, actually. This is the band, Korah and his band, the rebel Korah and his band. This relates more to the act of rebellion. This isn't passive rebellion like the children of Israel who wouldn't listen to their leaders, but rather this is the act of rebellion whereby Korah bald-faced confronts Moses and Aaron. What is it that drives rebellious, by the way? Have you ever asked that question? What is it that really drives the rebellious? Well, it's pride, it's envy, arrogance, jealousy. Those are the motivations for the proud. That is really at the core of it all. And so I want to read the account for you here in Numbers chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, and the sons of Reuben, took men, and they rose up before Moses with certain of the children of Israel, 250 princes of the assembly, famous in the congregation, men of renown. And so this nonsense wasn't just for the simple-minded. They were eaten up. The men of renown were eaten up by this nonsense. In verse 3, and they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and said unto them, you take too much upon you, seeing all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Wherefore then lift ye up yourselves above the congregation of the Lord. And I've seen this before. I have seen this before, actually. I've seen this before. Where, people who are proud come to the leadership and they say, you take too much upon you. In fact, if I'm honest with you, I remember an example where that happened to me. But that's not necessarily the only example that I have. You take too much upon yourself. What makes you holy? You're not any holier than anyone else. Well, nobody in the ministry that I'm aware of, unless they have a problem with pride, says that they're in that position because they're holy. In fact, the rub here is this. Wasn't it Moses who said, Lord, don't send me, send Aaron? Moses said, don't send me, send Aaron. And they're coming and they're saying, who do you think you are, lording yourself above the congregation? You're not anything special. Well, Moses was clear on that subject. He didn't think he was anything special either. But what really is behind these Korah and his band? Well, it's jealousy and it's pride. Pride. Jealousy and pride. And as I was putting this together, it came into my mind the similarities between this and Absalom, actually. Absalom wanted the people to look to him. And this is what, at the end of the day, this is what Korah is looking for. He's not looking to promote the people of the Lord. He's looking to promote himself. It's not like he has some altruistic motive here where he wants everybody to be elevated. No, Korah wants to be in charge. Korah wants to be the man that everybody looks to. And that's the problem with Absalom as well. And I don't want to read the whole section, but you can look in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 2 to 6. But let me just pick up in verse 4. Here's the setting. Absalom placed himself at the gate, and when the people of Israel were coming, he was saying, there's no man to stand for you. But if I were in power, I would stand for you. And he stole the hearts of the people that way. And verse 4, it says, Absalom said, moreover, oh, that I were made judge in the land. Oh, that I were made judge in the land. That every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. Unlike his father, who's not doing him justice. They're talking about David. Unlike his father, who's not doing him justice. I would do him justice. If they would look to me, and if they would come to me, I would sort out their cause, and I would give them justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh unto him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. Oh, wasn't that a sincere kiss? I'm sure that his heart was with him. No, it's just like a politician. They kiss the people. They say all of the things that the people want to hear. Then they get elected, and next thing you know, wait, what happened to all those things that you said you were going to do? Remember when you wanted our vote? Well, it's not practical. That's for another time. And the Congress and the House and so forth. And anyways. You're kissing the babies. Hey, Absalom was sitting at the gate kissing the babies. But in verse 6, and on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. And so Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So this is what's going on with Korah. He's not looking to promote others. Now, I remember one time where a certain person came and spoke against the leadership at Zion. And, I was in the presence of this conversation, and I heard them saying, oh, well, why don't we promote this pastor who was rather obscure? And why don't we promote this pastor who was obscure? And then they said, why don't we promote Frank Anderson, who's even more obscure than any of them? And at the end of the day, the thing was this. It wasn't that he was looking to promote any of those pastors. He wanted to promote himself. And oh, by the way, if you happen to call upon me, I'd be willing to. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. And so this is what's going on with Korah. Moses, you take too much upon yourself. We know Moses didn't take anything upon himself. He didn't even want the job. I mean, in the beginning, yes, we know he killed the Egyptian, but 40 years in the desert fixed him of that problem. And then he got to the place where he said, Lord, I'm not good of speech. I'm not, eloquent. Aaron's better speaker than I am. Why don't you send him? And so the Lord says, don't argue with me. You're the man. Aaron can go with you too, but you're the man. And then what he gets out of it is Korah standing up and saying, you take too much upon yourself, Moses. Isn't that the rub? And so here's the advice I've given to many young men everywhere I preach. It seems like more the men are caught up with these things than the ladies are, but I'm sure it's not exclusive. If you want God's blessing, then get behind your leaders. Period. Full stop. Sit like David on the backside of the desert. Sit like David on the backside of the desert and let God promote in His own good time. Psalm 75 verses 5 through 7 says, "Lift not up your horn on high, speak not with a stiff neck, for promotion cometh neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south. But God is the judge. He putteth down one, and He setteth up another." You know, I'm not saying I have accomplished anything in my life as far as the ministry goes, but whatever ministry God has given to me, and there has been a little bit of it, has been for me just sitting in the pew saying, I just want to be faithful to my pastor. And, you know, God has promoted, God has lifted, and, you know, God has done whatever God would choose to do. You have to be willing to sit on the backside of the desert. Now, it wasn't easy, and there were times when I went to Pastor Dan and I said, I feel like I need more opportunities and all that. I'm going to confess that. But at the end of the day, you wait till God brings you forward, and you wait until He does. The problem with Korah was he wanted promotion now. And we all know how that ended. The end of the Korah episode was natural death, physical death, and we find the account in Numbers chapter 16. I'll just refer you to it. The earth actually opened up and swallowed them. In fact, that was the point when God said to Moses, get away from them all. I'm going to destroy them all and make of you a great nation. And Moses interceded and said, no, Lord, remember your promise to Abraham. And then God said, all right then, tell the whole congregation to get away from Korah and his band. And so the counsel of Moses was get away from these wicked men. And they all fled from Korah and his men, and the earth opened up and swallowed not just the men, but everything they possessed, everything they owned, all went down to the pit alive, into hell. So while we aren't expecting the earth to open up and swallow anyone today, I will say this here, that the result of this is always spiritual death. It's always spiritual death. The pastor, by the way, that I referred to earlier, who said, why don't we promote some of the other pastors in obscurity? Today he himself is on a very barren, dry land. God is not going to promote a man like that. Now, moving on quickly here. We have another group here. We have, now this group is they're not wicked. Okay, we're not looking at a group that's wicked. We're just looking at a group that's settled for something less than what God had promised. Okay, this is different. We're in a different mindset right now here. We're not talking about wickedness. We're talking about brethren who settled for less than all that God had promised. And that would be in reference to the Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And I don't want to elaborate on this because, again, there's not wickedness here. We're just simply saying they settled for less than what God had called them to. In Numbers chapter 32, verses 2 through 5, the children of Gad and the children of Reuben came and spake unto Moses and Eleazar the priest and unto the princes of the congregation, saying, so forth. Jump down to verse 5. Wherefore said they, if we have found grace in thy sight, let this land be given unto us, unto thy servants for possession, and bring us not over this Jordan. And so basically what happened was this. They had cattle. They had much cattle. They were concerned about the cattle. And so like Lot, they saw that the land on the east side of Jordan was lush. And they said to Joshua, if we found grace in your sight, don't bring us across the Jordan. Let us stay here where the land is lush. And so they had more of a vision for their cattle than they did for being close to the temple, being close to where, the actual worship takes place. Now the key phrase is this. The part that gives us insight as to spiritually what's going on here is this. Bring us not over this Jordan. Bring us not over this Jordan. Now, we know that in the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God, we have the statement that without holiness no man shall see the Lord. And so the crossing of the Jordan, as we learned from the journey of the children of Israel, and I can recommend many good teachings along that line, books that have been written about that. The point to the crossing of the Jordan is that the old man is cut off. The old man is put to death. Joshua chapter 3, verse 15, or in that area, the water was cut off. And the water backed up to the city of Adam, connecting to crossing of Jordan with the dealing of Adam. And so in effect what they were saying was, we're okay to make this compromise. We don't bring us across the Jordan. The point is this here, they've settled for an outer court ministry. They just wanted a ministry to the cattle, and that's it. But we're called to more than just evangelism. We're called to more than just saving souls. That is a huge deal, of course. But we're called, in a relationship with Him. We're called to worship Him. We're called to know Him. We're called to see Him. We're called, to a place of holiness in His presence. There's going to come a time, by the way, when evangelism is no longer a ministry. There's going to come a time when evangelism is no longer a thing. And what we have carved out in our relationship with Him at that point, as we cross into eternity, is going to determine how we start our relationship with Him in eternity. So never despise the Romans 6:6, the crucified life experience. Never despise the Jordan and what it does in our lives. And don't settle for anything less. And so now we bring us to the last segment of people that we want to consider. And I'm interested in wrapping this up here pretty quickly. But in the last section here that we get into, we come into the time of the judges. Now, as we mentioned before, there is the time of Abraham, then there is the time in Egypt, there is a time in the wilderness, and then there is the 350 years during the time of the judges. Now, what is the sin that was prevalent in the time of the judges? And it's this, that every man did that which was right in their own eyes. They weren't referring to the commandments. They weren't living according to the standards God had established. But everyone was doing that which is right in their own eyes. And this is a huge problem today. I would say, in a certain sense, we are kind of in the time of the judges right now, where everyone is doing that which is right in their own eyes. It almost seems as though every discussion begins this way. Well, the way I figure it is this. Well, the way I see it is this. But you see, the way that we are supposed to see it is not the way that we see it, through humanistic eyes, through humanistic interpretations, but rather the way that we're supposed to see it is according to what God has spoken, according to the standards that He gave us, and according to the specific things that He's spoken in our lives. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 16 to 17, Moses predicted before he died that the children of Israel were going to deviate and were going to commit idolatry with the other nations, that was coming in their history, and it predicted exactly what took place during the time of the judges. The problem in the time of the judges were that the people of God mixed themselves with the world. They mixed themselves with the idols of the world, they mixed themselves with the practices of the world, and they lost their edge. The thing that gave Israel their edge was the law. That's what elevated them above all other nations in the land. But during the time of the judges, there was tremendous mixture. You read the book of Judges. I just taught Judges the end of last year in the Philippines. Well, actually, it was the beginning of this year. But you look at it and your mind is grasping. How do I make sense of this nonsense? The terrible base things that happen in the book of Judges. People getting cut in pieces and sending out to the 12 tribes of Israel. Terrible, evil, horrible things. Micah and his Levite that he hired. And then the Danites who came and gave him more money, so he forsook Micah. It was just confusion. Because there was no standard. Everybody did that which was right in their own eyes. And the Lord said in that little section, Deuteronomy 31, 16 to 17, He said, when they do this, I will forsake them. I will forsake them. And so for much of the period of the judges, you have very little fruit manifested that stays in the line. Very little fruit in the time of the judges, because most of them are doing what's right in their own eyes. It's exactly what happened according to the word of Moses before he departed. But that's not how we live in the kingdom. We're not supposed to do that which is right in our own eyes. We're not supposed to, through humanism and human emotions and intellect, figure out what the plan and purposes of God are. We've been given standards. We've been given commandments. We've been given promises, great and precious promises, as we read earlier. And we need to live as though we expect God to bring those things to pass. Absolutely. And so there was much apostasy during this time. They weren't being obedient to the heavenly vision, you might say. You know, that's what the Apostle Paul said to Agrippa. You know, God revealed himself to the Apostle Paul, and as he's given testimony of this to Agrippa in Acts chapter 26, he said, "Wherefore, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision." And I think that phrase, we want to keep that phrase in our minds. Lord, I don't want to be disobedient to the heavenly vision. You know, as I mentioned before, God has given to this church, He's given to this fellowship, and He's given to many of us individually, hopefully all of us individually, specific promises. By the time we end our lives, by the time we end this journey, we want to be able to stand before the Lord and say, I was obedient to the heavenly vision. I obeyed the heavenly vision. And like we said last week concerning Abraham, he wasn't even going to see it fulfilled in his lifetime. But he hoped with anticipation. He didn't stagger at the promises. He held his confidence steadfast to the end. And even though he died before he saw it fulfilled, he never gave up on that promise. And I said last week, when I stand before the Lord, I don't want to be ashamed and say, Lord, I didn't wait. If you wait and you believe the things that God has spoken, you will never be ashamed. We're told in the Scriptures, where there is no vision, the people dwell carelessly. And so the act that took place during the time of the judges was the mixing with other nations. It created great apostasy in the land, and God forsook them because of it. You see very little happening in the book of Judges that you could say really was a spiritual event. You can draw a lot of spiritual truths out of it, but for the most part, I concluded this. When I did my little study on the book of Judges in the Philippines, my conclusion was this. There's very few judges, actually, that I admired. Very few. They all have some sort of stain and some sort of spot on them. Deborah's one, by the way. Deborah's one that's admirable. Nothing negative said about Deborah. And Othniel, nothing negative said there. But most all of them else, Gideon, all of them. Samson, of course. You know, Gideon had idolatry that came forth from him, so that's a spot. But, you know, during the time of the judges, the big problem was every man did that which is right in their own eyes. We can't just do what's right in our own eyes. We can't live our life according to what is right in our own eyes. We've got to seek the Lord. We've got to ask for His counsels. We've got to follow His counsels, be obedient to the heavenly vision, and we come to our desired habitation. That's the plan that God's laid out for us. And so, mixing with other nations, well, the result is this, that there was no clear word during the book of Judges. That's why Samuel is such an amazing character. An amazing character. Maybe that'll be one of my future studies. I don't know. But because of the mixing, there was no clear word. Because there was no clear word, everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. And so, I want to bring this to a conclusion by saying this here. The promises that God gave to Abraham were immutable. Abraham didn't stagger. Abraham lived, according to those things being reality, and the promise continued through his seed on through, as we said last week, to Solomon's temple, but it doesn't stop there actually, because we also are children of Abraham, so the promise of Abraham overlay us, and it's going to take us actually right to the millennium. But here's the warning and here's the caution. Don't be someone who gets taken out of the line, because it's no longer immutable for us if we get knocked off course. The promise will be immutable as long as we remain faithful and obedient to the heavenly vision. But if we get knocked off course, that's a different thing. That's a different thing altogether. And so, as I mentioned, and I'm done here, as I mentioned, it is important that we cover the negative examples as well as the positive. If you've ever tried to start a car with just a positive lead, you'll realize what I'm talking about. You have to have the negative, otherwise it doesn't complete the circuit. But at any rate, we commit these thoughts to you, and praise the Lord. Thank you so much.